The rain had just begun to fall when Detective Harold Finch received the letter. It was the kind of rain that whispered against the windows, soft, persistent, and oddly mournful. Finch, retired now for nearly 10 years, sat in his worn leather chair by the fire, a cup of lukewarm tea beside him and the latest issue of the Times folded neatly on the table. He had once been a man of precision and routine, sharp suits, sharper instincts. But now, in his quiet cottage outside Bristol, his days had blurred into one another. That was until the letter arrived. The envelope was cream-colored, with elegant handwriting that spoke of old money and old manners. The return address read, Maple Hollow Manor, Devonshire. He hadn't heard that name in decades. Finch adjusted his spectacles and slit the envelope open with his brass letter opener. Inside was a short note, written on thick paper that smelled faintly of lavender. My dear Harold, I do hope this letter finds you in good health. I realize it has been many years since we last met, but there is a matter of great importance on which I must seek your counsel. Please, join me at Maple Hollow this Friday evening. Old times deserve closure. Sincerely, Edward Langley. Finch leaned back, frowning. Edward Langley. A name from another life. They had served together in the Metropolitan Police in the 1970s, Langley as a promising inspector, Finch as his pragmatic and cautious partner. They had parted ways after the Caldwell affair, a case that had never been officially solved and which had ended both their careers in scandal. He hadn't heard from Edward since. Finch considered ignoring the letter. But curiosity, the same insistent voice that had guided him through every case, would not let him rest. 3 days later, he was on the train to Devonshire. Maple Hollow stood on the edge of a great moor, surrounded by tall pines that whispered even when the air was still. The manor itself was a sprawling Victorian house, its once white facade now weathered by decades of wind and rain. Finch's cab pulled up just as the last traces of daylight slipped beneath the horizon. A manservant in a dark suit met him at the door. Detective Finch, Sir, Mr. Langley has been expecting you. Inside, the house was warm but heavy with a sense of aged dark wood, ticking clocks, the faint scent of polish and dust. Portraits of stern-looking ancestors lined the hallway. Finch followed the servant into a drawing room where a fire blazed and a group of people were gathered around a table set for dinner. Edward Langley rose to greet him. He was older, friendlier, his once black hair now silver, but his eyes were still sharp. Harold. It's been far too long. Nearly 30 years, Finch said, shaking his hand. You look well, considering. Langley chuckled. And you look exactly as I remember, ready to interrogate the furniture. The laughter that followed was polite, but strained. Finch glanced around the room, studying the other guests. There was Margaret Langley, Edward's wife, elegant, cold, and watchful. Dr. Samuel Hargrove, a family physician with the kindly demeanor of a man who knows too many secrets. Thomas Reed, Edward's nephew, a charming young man with expensive tastes. And finally, Clara Benton, Edward's personal secretary, quiet and efficient, with a beauty that seemed too self-contained to be comfortable. As they sat down to dinner, Finch felt that familiar stirring of instinct. Something was amiss. The tension at the table was subtle but palpable. Every smile seemed to conceal a private calculation. Conversation was light, politics, old cases, and the dreary weather. But as the meal wore on, Finch noticed how Edward's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his wine glass. His eyes darted toward Margaret more than once, and each time she met his gaze with a faint, dismissive smile. When dessert arrived, a beautiful pear tart, Edward raised his glass. To old friends, he said. and to old truths, finally brought to light. It was a curious toast. Later that night, Finch was shown to his guest room, a comfortable, if outdated, chamber overlooking the misty gardens. He undressed slowly, his mind replaying the evening's details. Edward Langley had been nervous. That much was clear. But nervous about what? Just as Finch was about to extinguish the lamp, a sound broke through the quiet, a faint metallic clink, followed by the low murmur of voices in the corridor. He slipped on his robe, opened the door slightly, and peered out. At the far end of the hall, Margaret Langley was speaking in hushed tones to Dr. Hargrove. Finch couldn't make out the words, but her expression was fierce, almost desperate. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, both figures disappeared into another room. He closed the door and returned to bed, though sleep did not come easily. He was awakened just before dawn by a loud knock at his door. "Mr. Finch." It was Clara Benton, pale and breathless. "You must come quickly, it's Mr. Langley, he's dead." Detective Harold Finch had seen death in every form imaginable: clean, cruel, accidental, deliberate. Yet, as he stood in Edward Langley's study that cold morning, there was something about the scene that disturbed him deeply. Langley sat slumped in his chair by the fireplace, his eyes half open, his mouth slightly ajar as though he had been about to speak. A decanter of brandy stood on the table beside him, one glass half full, another overturned. The smell of smoke and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. Clara Benton stood near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. Her lips trembled. "I came to bring him the Morning Post," she whispered. "He didn't answer, so I knocked, and then I saw." She stopped, covering her mouth. Finch moved closer, his old instincts fully awakened. "Did anyone else come in or out of this room after you found him?" "No, sir. I ran straight to fetch Dr. Hargrove." The doctor arrived moments later, carrying his black medical bag. He knelt beside the body, checked the pulse, then looked up grimly. "He's been dead for several hours," he said. "Heart failure, most likely." Finch frowned. "Most likely isn't good enough, doctor. He was in good health last night." "Age and stress," Hargrove replied curtly. "Edward had a weak heart for years. Perhaps too much excitement." Finch looked around the room. On the desk, papers were scattered: letters, notes, and what looked like the beginning of a handwritten statement. He leaned closer. The first line read, "If anything should happen to me, it will be one of them." And then, the ink trailed off. Finch's eyes narrowed. "Doctor, I'd prefer if the body not be moved just yet. I'll need to take a closer look before we call the coroner." Margaret Langley appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown but perfectly composed. "Mr. Finch," she said coldly, "surely you're not implying foul play? My husband had been unwell for weeks." "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Langley," Finch said evenly. "But if Edward invited me here for some matter of great importance, as his letter said, and now he's conveniently dead, well, I'd be a poor detective to ignore that." Her eyes hardened. "Detective, this is a family tragedy, not one of your old cases." Finch inclined his head slightly. "That remains to be seen." An hour later, the house gathered in the drawing room. The storm outside had turned fierce, cutting off the road to the village. No one would be leaving Maple Hollow until morning. Finch stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the uneasy faces before him. Margaret sat stiffly in an armchair, her expression carved from stone. Dr. Hargrove stood beside the mantel, avoiding her gaze. Thomas Reed, the nephew, paced restlessly near the window, lighting cigarette after cigarette. Clara Benton sat quietly, her eyes red from crying. "I won't waste time with formalities," Finch began. "Mr. Langley invited me here to discuss something important. And now he is dead, under circumstances I find troubling." Thomas exhaled a cloud of smoke. "You think one of us killed him? That's ridiculous." Finch's tone remained calm. "Perhaps. But until I know otherwise, everyone here will be treated as a potential witness or suspect." Margaret's lips thinned. "This is outrageous." "Outrageous would be pretending nothing happened," Finch replied. "Now, I'll need to ask each of you some questions. 1. Margaret Langley. They met privately in the library?" Finch noticed how her hands never stopped moving, folding, unfolding, adjusting the brooch at her collar. "You and your husband seemed distant," he began carefully. She gave a small laugh. "After 30 years of marriage, Mr. Finch, distance becomes a kind of comfort." "Did you argue last night?" Her gaze sharpened. "Edward and I disagreed often, but not last night. He was restless, anxious. I told him to get some sleep." "Did you know what was worrying him?" "No," she said. "Though I suspect it had something to do with his nephew." "Thomas." She hesitated. "Edward had recently changed his will. He never told Thomas. I warned him it would cause trouble." Finch made a note. "And who benefits from this new will?" She smiled faintly. "I do, of course. To Dr. Samuel Hargrove." The doctor was less composed. He avoided Finch's eyes, fiddling with the latch on his bag. "Doctor, you were the last to see him alive?" Finch asked. "Yes. Around 10:30. He said he couldn't sleep. I prescribed him something mild, valerian tincture." "Did you prepare the dose yourself?" "I did." Finch paused. "And you claim he died of heart failure?" Hargrove nodded quickly. "Without an autopsy, that's the most reasonable conclusion." Finch's voice was cool. "Reasonable conclusions have misled better men than you, doctor." Hargrove flushed. "If you're implying—" "I'm implying nothing. Yet. 3. Thomas Reed." The young man slouched in the chair, legs crossed, cigarette dangling from his lips. "So," he said with a smirk, "the great Harold Finch thinks there's a murderer in the family." Finch ignored the sarcasm. "Where were you last night after dinner?" "In the billiard room." "Alone? Anyone see you there?" "No. But I'm sure the brandy bottle remembers me." Finch's gaze didn't waver. "Your uncle changed his will recently?" Thomas's smirk faded. "He told you that?" "I didn't say he did." Thomas ground out his cigarette. "That old man would be left everything to his wife and that secretary of his if he could. He said I was reckless. But I wasn't the one wasting money on dying estates." Finch leaned forward slightly. "Did you love your uncle, Mr. Reed?" Thomas's eyes flickered. "Love's not the word I'd use." 4. Clara Benton. When Clara entered, she looked pale but steady. She sat opposite Finch, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "You were devoted to Mr. Langley," Finch said softly. "Yes," she whispered. "He was kind to me. Treated me like family." "Did you know about his will?" No. But he mentioned something about making things right before it was too late. Did he say what that meant? Tears welled in her eyes. No, only that some secrets shouldn't stay buried. By afternoon, Finch had gathered his notes, but no clear answers. Each of them had motive and opportunity. The rain continued to fall, hammering against the windows like impatient fingers. He returned to the study. The fire had burned down to embers. On the desk, the unfinished note still lay open. Finch stared at it for a long time, then began carefully examining the papers underneath. Most were mundane receipts, correspondence, but one envelope caught his eye. It was sealed and addressed simply to H.F. His initials. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Edward Langley's neat, deliberate handwriting. My dear Harold, if you are reading this, it means I have failed to stop what I feared most. You once told me the past has a way of finding us. You were right. Someone in this house carries the weight of an old sin, the Caldwell affair. I finally know the truth. But the cost of speaking it may be my life. Trust no one. Not even the ones who look innocent. The truth lies with the photograph hidden in the clock. Finch froze. The Caldwell affair. A case from 30 years ago, a botched investigation, a missing girl, a scandal that had destroyed reputations. And now, it seemed, the ghosts of that case had followed them both to Maple Hollow. He crossed the room, lifted the glass cover of the mantel clock, and carefully pried open its back panel. Inside, tucked behind the brass mechanism, was an old photograph, faded, torn at the edges. It showed 5 people, a younger Edward Langley, Harold Finch himself, Dr. Hargrove, and 2 others. One was unmistakably Margaret Langley. The other, Finch's breath caught, was the missing girl from the Caldwell affair. And she was standing arm in arm with Thomas Reed's father. The storm refused to let up. By evening, Maple Hollow was cut off completely. No telephones, no roads, no chance of help until morning. The house seemed to shrink under the weight of the rain and wind, its corridors echoing with the creaks of age and secrets long kept. Detective Harold Finch sat by the dying fire in the study, the photograph laid out before him. 5 faces from the past, 5 people tied together by a case that had never truly died. The Caldwell affair. He remembered it vividly. 1979, a wealthy industrialist's daughter, Eleanor Caldwell, vanished after a charity event. No ransom note, no body, only rumors of scandal and cover ups. The case had collapsed when evidence disappeared from police custody, and 2 officers, Finch and Langley, had taken the fall. Now, decades later, her face stared up at him from a hidden photograph in Langley's clock. Alive. Smiling. Standing beside Thomas Reed's father, Robert Reed, and a young Margaret Langley. Finch poured himself a small measure of brandy. His hands trembled slightly as he thought of Edward's final words, "Trust no one." A soft knock broke his concentration. Clara Benton stood at the door, clutching a candle. "Mr. Finch," she whispered, "Mrs. Langley asked me to tell you dinner is ready. Though I doubt anyone will eat much tonight." Finch nodded. "Clara, one question, if I may. How long have you worked for the Langleys?" 8 years, she said. "Since Mr. Langley retired from the police board." "Did he ever speak of the Caldwell affair?" She hesitated. "Once. He said it was the only case he ever regretted." "What did he mean by that?" Her eyes lowered. "He said, the wrong person paid the price." Before Finch could ask more, A sharp crack of thunder rattled the windows. Clara flinched. "I'll see you in the dining room," she murmured, retreating down the hallway. Dinner was a grim affair. The once grand table looked almost absurd, laden with untouched food under the flickering chandelier. Margaret Langley presided at the head, her posture impeccable despite her husband's death less than 12 hours before. Thomas Reed toyed with his fork, his usual arrogance dulled by tension. Dr. Hargrove sipped quietly at his wine, eyes flicking nervously between Finch and Margaret. Clara sat silently, avoiding everyone's gaze. Finch broke the silence. "Mr. Langley hid a letter in his study," he said. "He believed someone in this house might wish him harm." Margaret's fork froze mid-air. "That's preposterous." Finch ignored her. "He also mentioned the Caldwell affair. That got their attention." Hargrove's glass slipped slightly in his hand. Thomas frowned. "What's that got to do with anything?" "It's an old case," Finch said slowly. "One that destroyed Edward's career and mine. But he seems to have uncovered new evidence before his death." Margaret's voice turned icy. "You mean to suggest my husband's death was murder?" Finch met her eyes. "I'm saying your husband was silenced before he could reveal something." The room fell utterly still. Then Thomas laughed a short, nervous bark. "You're chasing ghosts, old man. My uncle was obsessed with that case. Maybe it finally drove him mad." "Perhaps," Finch said, "but madness doesn't hide photographs in clocks." Margaret rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I want to listen to this." She swept from the room. A moment later, Dr. Hargrove muttered, "You shouldn't provoke her. She's not as calm as she appears." Finch studied him. "And what do you mean by that, doctor?" But Hargrove only shook his head. "Nothing. Forget I said it." Later that night, Finch returned to the study. He wanted to think, to connect the threads before the storm lifted and the authorities arrived. He spread his notes across the desk: Edward Langley dead, possibly poisoned. Hidden letter warning of betrayal. Photograph linking every person in the house to the Caldwell affair. He underlined one phrase in his notebook: "The wrong person paid the price." He was still staring at it when the door creaked open. Thomas Reed stepped inside, his face pale, his hair damp from rain. "You need to stop this, Finch." "Stop what?" "Digging. My uncle's death was tragic, but dragging up the past won't help anyone." Finch leaned back in his chair. "You sound nervous, Thomas." "Damn right I'm nervous. You think I don't know what people whisper, that I'll end up like my father?" "Your father," Finch said quietly, "was involved with Eleanor Caldwell, wasn't he?" Thomas froze. "Where did you hear that?" "I didn't. I saw it. In a photograph hidden by your uncle." For a moment, the young man looked as though he might strike him. Then his shoulders sagged. "You don't understand. My father loved her. She wasn't kidnapped, she ran away with him. But something went wrong." "What went wrong?" "She died," Thomas whispered. "An accident. They were going to leave the country, but she fell from the cliffs near Brighton. Uncle Edward helped cover it up to protect the family name." Finch's eyes narrowed. "And your father?" "He shot himself a year later. Out of guilt." Finch considered this. Then why would Edward be afraid now, after all these years? Thomas swallowed. "Because someone else knew. Someone in this house. Before Finch could respond, a piercing scream echoed through the hall. They both raced toward the sound. Dash dash. In the drawing room, Margaret Langley stood frozen, her face white as paper. At her feet lay Dr. Hargrove sprawled beside the sofa, his teacup shattered on the floor. Finch knelt to check the pulse. None. His eyes flicked to the cup. A faint chemical smell rose from the spilled liquid. Poison, Finch murmured. The same as Edward, perhaps. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Dear God, what's happening in this house? Finch looked up at her. That's what I intend to find out. Dash dash. As the storm raged outside, Finch gathered the remaining three, Margaret, Thomas, and Clara, in the study. The firelight cast long, quivering shadows across their faces. We now have two deaths, he said gravely. Edward Langley and Dr. Hargrove. Both sudden. Both suspicious. Thomas paced restlessly. Are you saying someone here's killing us off one by one? I'm saying someone here has a secret worth killing for. Finch turned to Margaret. Dr. Hargrove implied you were unstable. Care to comment? Her eyes flashed. He was a fool. Always meddling in matters that didn't concern him. Such as the truth about your husband's past. She rose to her full height. If you think I poisoned Edward, you're mad. He was my husband. And your ticket to inheritance, Finch replied coolly. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. Enough. If you think it was my aunt, prove it. Otherwise stop this circus. Finch's tone softened. I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to finish what Edward started. Somewhere in this house is the proof he died for. He looked toward Clara. You've been quiet, Miss Benton. Clara's voice was barely audible. I think I know where to look. They all turned to her. When I was sorting Mr. Langley's correspondence last week, she said, he told me to lock one drawer in his desk and never open it. He said it contained a confession. Dash dash. Moments later, Finch pried open the locked drawer with a letter opener. Inside was a sealed envelope labeled, to be opened in the event of my death. He unfolded the letter slowly. 30 years ago, I helped conceal a death. Eleanor Caldwell did not die in an accident. She was killed in a moment of jealousy by Margaret Reed. Her husband, Robert Reed, and I covered it up to protect her. We buried the truth, but it has poisoned every life since. When Robert took his own life, I thought justice had found us. But I was wrong. Now the past demands payment. If anything happens to me, it will be by the same hand that killed Eleanor. Finch lowered the letter. Silence filled the room. Margaret Langley's face had gone ashen. Thomas whispered, Margaret Reed, my mother. Finch nodded. Your mother. Now your aunt by marriage. Margaret's voice trembled. He was lying, he was senile. Two people are dead, Finch said softly. Senility doesn't poison tea. She backed away slowly, her hand trembling as it reached toward her pocket. Finch's eyes caught the faint glint of metal. Don't, he warned. But Margaret's composure finally broke. You don't understand. I had to stop him. He was going to destroy everything. The gun trembled in her hand as the wind howled through the shutters. Then a shot rang out. Arthur Kane sat in the parlor of the lighthouse once more, the wind outside moaning like a restless soul. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the rhythmic crashing of waves steady, relentless, like the ticking of a clock counting down to revelation. Everyone was gathered, Eleanor, pale but calm, Captain Briggs, his jaw tight, young Simon, fidgeting nervously, and Margaret, the housekeeper, clutching her rosary. Kane rose slowly, his cane tapping the floor. "I suppose you all deserve to know," he said quietly, "how this puzzle fits together and who among you bears the weight of a life taken 20 years ago." Eleanor inhaled sharply. Briggs muttered a curse. The boy stared wide-eyed. Kane began pacing. First, there was the matter of the letter. A confession unsigned, but written with a hand that trembled, a hand accustomed to salt and rope, not pen and ink. That letter spoke of guilt and storms, of a body never found. It was sent to Eleanor, to lure her back here. But not by the man she thought. He turned, eyes glinting. "It wasn't he, your brother, Mrs. Waverley. It was someone who wanted the truth uncovered, or perhaps, controlled." Briggs slammed his fist on the table. "You're saying I sent that letter? Bloody nonsense." Kane didn't flinch. "I'm saying you were part of it. But not the author." He paused, then drew from his coat a small photograph, warped and faded. It showed a group of 5 people: Eleanor's brother Thomas, Captain Briggs, young Simon's father, Margaret, and a 4th man with dark hair and a confident grin. "Do you recognize him?" Kane asked, holding it up. Margaret's lips quivered. That's Mr. Harlow. The keeper before Briggs took over." Kane nodded. "Exactly. The man who drowned that night. Or so you all claimed." Eleanor frowned. "What are you implying, Mr. Kane?" "That he didn't drown," Kane said softly. "He was murdered." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. He continued, voice calm but firm. "The storm was real, yes. But Harlow's death was not an accident. The others, Briggs, Thomas, and the boy's father, found out he was smuggling artifacts from the wrecks he guarded. When they confronted him, a fight broke out. He fell, struck his head on the lantern base. In panic, they weighted him and dropped him into the sea." Briggs's face drained of color. How could you possibly?" "The confession," Kane interrupted. "It wasn't his. It was your own, Briggs. Written years later, under drink. Margaret found it after your stroke. You forgot it existed." The housekeeper broke into quiet sobs. "I wanted to destroy it," she whispered. "But Miss Eleanor, she deserved the truth." Eleanor covered her mouth, tears brimming. "My brother, he helped cover up a murder." Kane nodded slowly. "He tried to stop it, but fear won. Guilt ate him alive. That's why he left, why he stopped writing. The sea didn't take him, his conscience did." For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the storm's dying echoes filled the silence. Briggs sank back in his chair, broken. "So what now? You'll turn me in at my age?" Kane's gaze softened. "The law has little interest in ghosts. But confession has its own power. You've been living in this lighthouse, surrounded by reminders, storms, solitude, the endless watching. Maybe that's punishment enough." Eleanor wiped her tears. "And Simon?" Kane looked at the boy gently. "He deserves to know the truth of his father and to choose a different path." The detective turned toward the window. The first light of dawn pierced the horizon, painting the waves gold. "Some crimes," he said quietly, "are solved not by justice, but by time. The sea keeps its secrets, but it also returns them, when it's ready." He took his hat, bowed slightly to Eleanor, and left the lighthouse. Outside, the air was cold but clean. As Kane walked down the narrow path toward the shore, the gulls cried above, and he felt for the first time in years something like peace. The wind carried the faint toll of the lighthouse bell behind him, as if marking the end of an era. Candle the end.